10 years after the attacks of 9/11, former Governor John Rowland looks back at the state's response and reaction to overwhelming loss. And it is almost time for another round of elections. The Secretary of the State is here to talk about new efforts to get more and earlier voting in Connecticut. Hi, you're watching The Real Story. I'm Lori Perez. In 1 week, the world will mark the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. It was in many ways a defining moment for national and local leaders across the country. As most of us sat stunned, glued to the TV for days, politicians turned emergency responders. Former Governor John Rowland is here to talk about the call to action that day. Thanks for being here.
You bet.
Let's start at the beginning because I think everyone has their own remembrances of where they were at the moment that they found out.
Well, you and I are both too young to remember where we were when JFK was shot, which was kind of the previous generation, but I think everybody remembers where they were when they first heard about the 9/11 tragic, horrific terrorism attack. Actually, in my case, I was having a meeting of business executives at the executive residence, and my wife came in and said, hey, listen, you better take this call from Washington. And Lacey Kaufman was my chief of staff in Washington. She happened to be, and is, the sister of Andy Card, who's the chief of staff to President Bush. Mm-hmm. And she said very quickly, hey, the tower has been hit. It's not an accident, which most of us all thought it was. She said, we're under some sort of attack. I don't know the details. So I shot down to the emergency response center. And, going through everybody's mind is it's so horrific and so surreal. How could this be happening? What's going to happen next? And it's a numbing feeling. My thoughts immediately were 40,000 of our Connecticut residents in New York City. And I'm thinking, how do we get these folks back? I called Mayor Giuliani, I called Governor Pataki that afternoon, and I said, how can we help? And so volunteers, and we had, a lot of our construction folks went down to 9/11. We had our state troopers down there. We had paramedics. We had our K-9 unit down there in those first few days trying to find missing loved ones. And so the first few hours and days were so chaotic because people really didn't know what happened to their loved ones. There was no finality. So we tried to aid New York City the best we could, and then kind of reflect on the families that had lost a loved one just a couple of days later after we tried to do all we can in an emergency response effort. I'm
wondering how quickly that day did things come together? I mean, how quickly was the National Guard and Connecticut's police and firemen assembled?
Well, within hours, because I was in the emergency center first thing, and then we brought in our commissioners. And then, the focus was, all right, are we safe first? And we think about Millstone, for example, in the sub-base. And so we kind of made sure that there was frozen airspace there. And at that time, if you remember, for days afterwards, the airspace was frozen. And then you start, probably the defining moment for me, I'd called down to the governor and I said, listen, we're clearing all the beds out of Fairfield County in the hospitals to make sure that we can take care of those that are injured. And hours later, I remember getting a call saying, Governor Rowland, we're not going to need the beds because there really aren't going to be any injuries. And that was the moment where you really realize, holy smokes, how do all these people, we don't know how many were at the time, how do you survive an implosion of two buildings? And so that really defines how massive and horrific that event was when you think there's not even going to be many survivors. And so, those first 2 days and hours, you're trying to respond. And one of the things we did do was we started to meet all the trains coming back from New York that evening. And I remember one woman looking at me, and she was all covered with dust. And I was pretty shaken, to be honest with you. And I kind of grabbed her. I said, are you all right? And she said, I just want to get home to my family. Mm-hmm. And you realize that, this was she escaped death. I mean, she had been next to the site. And so mental health experts were there. And as you recall, I began to start to call the families that were affected in Connecticut. And that, for me, was a very emotional time and a very stressful time, but very spiritual time, because you're talking to folks who really, at the beginning, those first days or two, were unsure of what happened to their loved one. Were they in a hospital nearby? Had they gone to a friend's house? Did they survive the implosion? And so there's a lot of uncertainty in those first few days.
What did you had mental health counselors with you. What did they tell you to say to the people when you called?
Yeah, we talked about this weeks ago. You know, one of the things as I was calling family members, at first I was just calling to help getting the families down to ground zero to get information on their loved ones. And that process was chaotic at best. And then, of course, the Red Cross was involved. And then I started to realize that these people needed help with their kids. I mean, imagine an 8-year-old watching these towers going down, realizing that their dad worked there. And how do you figure that all out? So we brought in a lot of mental health counselors. But I actually had a mental health counselor sitting with me as I talked to the family members. What should I say and what should I not say? And as each day went by, I made more and more calls, and we found all kinds of problems: financial issues, life insurance issues. Some companies lost everybody in their company, and we had, as you know, about 150 or so families that were affected, mostly Fairfield County, but throughout the state. And so, we tried to be very parochial and take care of those folks the best we could and give them a support system to get through this and to get through all the filings and the information. And again, dealing with the Red Cross was no easy task during those days.
Can you give us an idea of when you were making those calls, how much did you encounter people who were holding on to hope?
Well, that's a great question, because I didn't know where people, I was calling them cold. And as I made the inquiry, which is why the mental health folks were helpful for me, don't say, I know how you feel or I know what you're going through, because you don't. Different stages. Everybody, some people they accepted what happened to their loved ones. Other ones were holding out hope. I'll never forget when I went down to ground zero the day after 9/11. Just a scene of paper and smoke, but there were thousands of people walking around, and they'd have a piece of paper with their loved one's picture and a description, and they'd run up to you. They'd say, "Have you seen my son? Have you seen my father?"
That's heartbreaking.
It was heartbreaking in that first day, but making the calls was heartbreaking as well.
And how long did that actually take you?
Oh, probably a good 10 days. And as I talked to folks, some were getting ready to have services, others were having trouble just getting their arms around the event. A lot of folks were having some significant financial issues, because remember, a lot of these families had pretty young husbands and fathers and women working down there. It wasn't that whole atmosphere down there, the work atmosphere, the environment, is a pretty young group of people, high income and fairly young. So they had a significant financial issues that they were facing the days and weeks and months afterwards.
And so how was Connecticut able to help them?
Well, we actually got involved in a number of different ways. We did the memorial at Sherwood Island, which really worked out beautifully in terms of helping the families and counsel the families. We actually assigned mental health counselors to work with the families and the children. The Red Cross was having great difficulties giving the millions and trillions of dollars that were raised during that time. Remember all the fundraising events. And the Red Cross was good at, responding in a storm or a fire and giving food and shelter, but giving finances to people in Fairfield County was a tough issue for them, and there were some big issues that came from that days and weeks later. But for the most part, I put an office together, and Brian Mattiello, who worked for me, really was assigned to working with the families, and we got to know many of the families, and many of them pursued a number of different issues. Some of them kind of dealing with their grief, many of them becoming great advocates for a variety of issues and fighting on behalf of the families in the congressional hearings and all the things that happened afterwards.
Right. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back with John Rowland and continue talking about his reflections of 9/11.